Glad to have you here today. Thank you for coming. This has just been an amazing experience. It's one of the characteristics of this project that God just keeps showing up in such amazing ways, and having you here is one of those ways, and we thank you.
Up, but I can make something up to say. I really enjoyed last night. I've heard Dr. Patrick speak, I think, scores of times at this point, and I still really learned some things last night. And in fact, I'm looking forward to getting the recordings to hear them again, because if you might have noticed, there's a lot of information fast, and he goes through it faster than I can always think about it and digest it. So there will be recordings of these things, because most of this is worth hearing again. He certainly said a few things last night that I said to myself, I should memorize that so I can say that myself. And I can't remember what any of those are right now, so I'm not doing all that well on it, but it'll be recorded. So hopefully you'll be able to find that. So this morning, are you done with relativism, or are we going to work on that some more and then?
And I will be backtracking every now and again. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to talk about tolerance this morning, which interestingly is a Christian virtue, right? But virtues put in the wrong place can turn into something else. So, Dr. Patrick.
One of the interesting things that... Can you hear me at the back? Yeah, because I tend, being British, we eat the ends of our words. I don't know if you've noticed that, but that's the way we speak. You have to guess the last syllable quite frequently. You get good at it with time. But if I fade away and you still want to hear, wave, and I'll try and change that. But this third career in my life has been one of the most interesting ones, and the fact that I spoke mainly to physicians accounts for the fact that I go so fast, because the one thing physicians learn to do, as in their training, is when somebody comes into your office to see you, you're forming potential diagnoses from the first sentence onwards, and what's going on in your head, if you try and think about it, is you cast them aside as you find a reason for not believing them, or you put them on the other side. That looks as though it might be it, and eventually the diagnosis falls out. So docs are used to taking in large amounts of information. I say they're rather like cows. It's a good analogy. When you're going to see a doctor, think of a cow, and they take in huge amounts of rubbish, and then they ferment it for several hours and chew it over again, and that's the way it works. Well, we do the same with patient information. So it's easy to bore a physician. So good speakers, when I meet them at conferences and they're going to talk to docs, I say 4 points will only last you 10 minutes if you want to keep them going, whereas 4 points will do an hour in an ordinary environment. But you need a lot more than that to keep physicians interested. And they'll go away and do exactly what Ty was describing. And for me, the invention of recording was very important. I didn't realize, because I was unaware that I was even being recorded the first time it happened to me. And Americans played a huge role in my life at that point, and it makes the point that Ty was making very well. As I think I told you earlier, I was an invisible Christian till I was in my 40s, outside of my home, and to a lesser extent in the church, but certainly didn't show up to any significant degree in the university unless somebody asked a question. They'd get a Christian answer. So those who were close to me knew that I was a Christian, but I didn't spend time on that. I was caught in that famous line of Gray's elegy, "Let not ambition mock their useful toil, their homely joys." Jobs and ambition can be great mockers. One of the ways you prevent that happening is keeping the Sabbath, by the way. That's a throwaway line for you to think about. Not as a legalistic thing, but as a day for practicing being a prince, or if you're sexist, a princess. Jeremiah 17 is where you find it. But anyway, I was pulled out of that environment. Amongst other things, there had to be about half a dozen pressures on my life, but one of them was the Faculty of Education, and the result was a talk called The Myth of Moral Neutrality, which I wrote as a paper. But then shortly afterwards, I got a call from CMDA, headquarters, the Christian Medical Dental Association of the US, and it was David Stevens, who'd been a missionary doctor in Kenya done an amazing job. I mean, he took over what had been a one-man mission hospital for 20 years. Today, it's the best training hospital in Kenya. And one man basically did that, and his name is David Stevens, an American. An amazing job. Going to Tenwick. If any of you are wondering whether there's a role for you in the developing world, Tenwick would be a good place to go for a visit. Anyway, he came back from doing that job and was asked to take over CMDA. Now, he's a very, very intelligent man who wanted to go to the mission field above all else, and he took the shortest possible route to get there. So he didn't get the education he should have had. So when he took over this job, he was smart enough to realize, this was back in the early 90s, or late 80s, around 1990 anyway, he realized that medicine was sailing towards very choppy water. I mean, your church is going to need a power of attorney program to protect you when you go to hospital when you're over 60, because we're going to start killing you. He realized that sort of thing was in the distance. He had no idea what to do about it, he told me. And he called me and he said, I have just listened to a recording of yours. And I said, no, you haven't. I don't make recordings. And he said, it's your voice. Couldn't argue with that. And it was the myth of moral neutrality. And to this day, I don't know where it was recorded. He said it was an amateur recording, so I probably made without me being aware of it. But he said, it's not a good recording. Please come and do it properly. And they ended up persuading me to come down to the States, and I recorded 5 talks. My wife was in Africa for a year. When she left, I gave 6 talks a year and was home at 6 o'clock every day, never brought work home from work. When she got back, I was giving 100 talks a year all over the continent, and my life had changed. So beware of David Stevens. He will change your life if he gets his fingers into it. But I'm very grateful for what he did. But I realized that what they liked about what I do, what doctors like, and is not so good for other audiences, that they, if they're doing surgery is 99% boredom and 1% panic, And so during the 99% boredom, they can chew over what they've heard. So they listen to these things on the way to work and then think about it in the OR. Some of them, surgeons are very arrogant. Some of them even play my CDs while they're operating, and everybody has to listen to them. They can do that. So I tend to go too fast. As David said, he'd listened to that tape 6 times, and I've now got used to that idea. But it's also a joy, because I have the most wonderful experiences because of it. I've told some of you this. Those of you who are doctors probably heard me say this, because it really blew me away. But a couple of years ago, we were visiting my daughter in Malawi, and where she looks after about 80 to 100 abandoned children with her husband and children. And then we were flying to South Africa. I'm at the age where I have aches and pains, and I don't like long flights, but I do them, and then ache a bit afterwards. So I was being a bit of a curmudgeon. My wife doesn't take a scrap of notice of that, so it doesn't really matter. I just vent on her, and she shrugs. We went through security, and when we got through, there wasn't a seat left except for her. So I was standing, because the airport was built in the 1950s. The planes have got bigger, but the airport hasn't. So after a few minutes, the guy next to her put a bag on the seat, and I said, "Sir, is anyone coming for that seat?" And he looked up and said, "No, I'm so sorry." And he moved the bag. I said, "Please sit down." And to make him feel a little better, I said, "I don't notice what's going on around me either when I'm reading my Kindle." And he stopped and looked at me and said, "Have we met?" And I said, "2 white guys in the middle of Africa? Not very likely." And then he said, "I don't recognize you. It's your voice." And then he said, "Just put yourself in my position. I was complaining about what God was letting me do when I should have been saying thank you." And this guy said, "You gave some lectures in Cape Town in 1999, didn't you?" And I said, "I was there somewhere around then." He said, "I didn't hear them, which is why I don't recognize you. I was on an elective. But Ben Gaunt recorded 6 of them, and he gave me a set of tapes. And he said, I wore them out. I live in England now because we got caught up in some of the nasty violence and we need a break. But the best 2 weeks of my year are the 2 weeks I spend helping in a mission hospital in Malawi. And if I hadn't met you on tape, I would never even have thought about doing that. Thank you. Such a joy to meet you. What did you say when God does something like that to you? That grace is the one thing in my life that makes me cry. I can go into a tragedy and get on with what has to be done, but I find grace overwhelming. I hope you do too. It's amazing the way it turns up. And one of the most important things I hope that you'll realize about the project that we're proposing here is the young people who go away from a course like the one we teach have a much greater sense of grace in their lives than they had at the beginning. And that's the best witness we have. The gospel was gossiped, wasn't it, in the first century? There was no organization. People looked at them and said, these guys love one another. And it is an extraordinary thing that we need to make much more use of. When you go on holiday, do you make an attempt to meet the Christians in the place where you've gone on holiday? You should. I've learnt this. I had to be taught it. Right at the beginning of this last, now over 30 years, I was actually doing some public policy work with a Catholic lawyer. And we'd been in Alberta, we'd driven over the Rockies, and we didn't have anything in Vancouver till the next morning. And I said to him, let's stop in Abbotsford. I know someone there, she'll tell me where to go to a quiet motel. And I called her, and she was an ex-Zairian missionary with her husband, and she said, what do you mean, a motel? You'll come here. I said, we're just on the outskirts of Abbotsford. We can't just drop in. She said, of course you can. And once we'd had a meal, she sat me down and read the Riot Act, basically. She said, you have a duty to stay with Christian families. Because most young people, by the time they're teenagers, think their parents are dull and boring. And when you turn up, they realize Christian life does not have to be dull and boring. You need to stay with families. And she was so right. Before I left here, I had to make a call to an ex-alumnus, not an ex, he is an alumnus, who took the course at Augustine 19 years ago. And he's now an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine and Radiotherapy at Queen's, just an hour's drive from where I am. And one of the men in my men's group was under his care, so I gave him a call to say, you've got a friend of mine, a Dutch guy, who's very quiet, but he's a deeply committed Christian. He would really love you to pray with him. And then we had a talk about what had happened over the years and what the course had meant. He said, it's so hard to explain. He said, it's been one of the most important experiences in my life, but I can't explain it in a way that makes sense to the modern world. That's true. We can't explain our conversions. Tell your conversion story that way. Bear witness to the reality that you know and acknowledge, I can't explain it in a way that you call an explanation. But we are people who love one another easily. In the sense of love as obedience, not love as a feeling. I hope you don't think of love as a feeling. Biblical love is not feelings are God's category, not yours. God can make you feel good anywhere he wants. The best feel-good time of my life was in a refugee camp for 2 months. But that's not what he's after. He wants you to love as obedience. If you love me, keep my commandments. And when you do that, you're amazed what happens. Lewis puts it beautifully. He says that if you make your life a search for joy, you will never find it. But if you make it a search for obedience, joy will come in the deal. He puts it much better than that. But it's true. So hospitality is vitally important. And have the grace to allow other people to love you. It's hard to do. I arrive in the US and I am looked after spectacularly every time. And that's a great privilege. When I started doing this, the guy in the next office to me in the Department of Biochemistry could not understand how I could negotiate with the dean to give a bit of my salary away and have 1 day a week off when I wanted to. And he says, you go to different places all the while. How do you arrange it? I said, somebody sends me an email, and I say, yes, that's it. And he says, do you know people everywhere? I said, no. But I never have any difficulty recognizing them as I'm walking off the plane and they're waiting at the other end. Christians can see one another. Of course, they have some vague idea of what I look like because they've seen a picture somewhere. But it's amazing. And the really interesting thing, which he couldn't understand at all, I said, typically they'll take me to their home, and given the vagaries of airport travel, I might be sitting around reading for a few hours before I do anything. And they might be busy. They've never met me in their life. They let me into their house. They say, would you like to borrow a car? The keys are there. Help yourself to anything in the house. They've never met me. How can they do that? And I can say to them within a few hours, we've only known one another for 3 or 4 hours. Let's imagine that the People's Republic of Canada decides that I shouldn't have any money. I could give you everything I've got with no paper trail whatsoever and come back any time in the next 20 years and collect it. And you know that, and I know that. That is an incredible gift. And it's not found elsewhere. It's not in other cultures. I have a Muslim sister-in-law. She's not a practicing Muslim anymore, and both her children, one is a committed Christian and one is going to be shortly. But my brother-in-law farmed in Africa for 25 years, mainly in Kenya. They had the farm next to Joy Adamson's place, for those of you who ever saw Born Free. Amazing place. I remember sitting on their porch and seeing 35 different birds in an hour. And hippos cut the grass in the evening. Amazing place. But when they were leaving, knew they were going to leave, Tim gave my wife, his sister, I think it was $5,000 or something to bring back to Canada. And of course there was no paper of any sort. And Roshan said to Tim, we'll never see all that money. And Tim said, what on earth do you mean? Of course we will. Of course, not only did they see the money, but when they arrived, the church had turned out to winterize their farm. This was an incredible impact on Roshan. She said, well, in a Muslim community, even within the family, we wouldn't get quite all of it back. And outside the family, we wouldn't expect to get it back at all. And we certainly wouldn't turn out to winterize the home of a Christian. That's the most powerful influence there is. I often say that I think that the spread of the gospel in the Mediterranean in the first century was basically due to childcare. I mean, there was no structure yet. They had the Old Testament, they had the Jews. Fortunately, they were largely Jewish. And they had odd letters that Paul and the apostles had written. Not very much in the way of structure. They were oppressed by the state to a considerable degree. They certainly didn't have any buildings or anything like that. But the first letter that I know of, written by a Roman official about Christians, is amazing. It says this: these Christians are not exposing their own children, and moreover, they are rescuing the exposed children of others. What should I do? The Romans never solved the problem. What were they talking about? Well, they're talking about infanticide. Throughout human history, people have always thought that another child cannot. That's always been the case. And in the ancient world, abortion was only for the very wealthy and only for Caesar's family, and a good many of his nieces usually died because he'd raped them and they had to have an abortion. They didn't survive the experience. But for ordinary people, there's a place at the city gates in many parts of the Middle East where you could dump a baby you didn't want. And that's important to know. So the next bit is artistic license on my part. The range of people who became Christian in the first century were loved into the church. And they met to worship when they could. And I imagine that after worship meetings, just like us, they talk. But their world had been changed. So they would be talking about how amazing the Christian life had been. They were really in awe of grace. And then they noticed that one couple was a bit quiet, and they said, "Are you all right?" They said, "Well, what you're saying is true, but we're pregnant and we don't think we can manage another baby." And what do you think they said? I'm sure, I know what they said. They said, we'll help. Because they said, yeah, a baby is a gift from God, and God's gifts are good. You've got to trust God with your fertility if you really want to know who God is. And they did that. And of course, children make communities, don't they? If your church is anything like a community and a single mum comes in, her life ought to be better from that moment onwards, right? That's sort of basic minimum evidence that the church is alive and well. And that's what happened, of course. Now, what about the next bit? Well, imagine you're a little girl of about 11. And mum and dad say to you, we have a special story to tell you. We were walking through the city, and we went through the city gates, and someone had left you by the city gates on the ground. And as we passed, the love of Jesus so flowed through us that we had to pick you up. And we're so glad we did. Do you need to preach the gospel to that child? It's done, isn't it? Signed, sealed, and delivered. Preach the gospel. If necessary, use words. And of course, what it also led, all states decay. One of the ways they decay is sexual promiscuity and decreasing fertility. That happened to the Romans. At the same time, thriving Christian communities obey the rule of Genesis, and they grow. And we're still winning that battle in the Western world. Agreed, nowhere in the Western world is the population growing from within its borders. You grow because you have a leaky southern border, and you can be glad that it's Mexico and not Iran. But otherwise, you wouldn't be growing either. But within that data, there is some good news. People of faith have on average 3 children. Secularists have 1. We win. And if we trusted God a bit more and we had 4, we'd win quicker. But that's important to recognize. That's the world that we inhabit. Now, that world is different, particularly in the area of ethics. Now, teaching ethics is a total waste of time. Again, when we started the college, we have a good example of this. An extraordinary thing happened 25 years ago when we were still in our reading group stage. We were headhunted by the Beijing government, indirectly, from two or three guys from Hong Kong. It was still independent at that point. Sent us an email saying, we know you meet and where, and we would like to talk to you, and we suggest the Novotel down the street would be a nicer place. Better breakfast than we were usually having, so we said yes. And when we got there, we said, what's this all about? And they said, we're headhunting for teachers in China. And we said, well, you come to the wrong place. We're all Christians. They said, we know that. We said, that doesn't make sense. It does, they said, but have breakfast first and we'll explain. And what they had to say was amazing. Would that we had governments as sophisticated in some ways. They said, you in the West think that our problems are due to our backwardness in economic and technical terms. 25 years ago, that was true. They said, we can fix both those, and we will. Our real problem is corruption, and that is not so easy to fix. We know that teaching ethics to 23-year-olds is a waste of time. And we have looked at what you have done in the West, and we are quite convinced that the reason your ethics were better has got something to do with the stories that children hear when they're young. But we don't understand those stories adequately because we don't understand the metaphors, which of course are all biblical but slightly modified. So the first teacher they wanted was David Jeffrey, now emeritus at Baylor. And the first course they wanted was the Bible in English literature. And they brought early childhood educationists from all over China to the University of Beijing so that he could preach to them. I mean, he was very subtle. He didn't preach. He taught them literature. But of course, they wanted, the title over the top was the Bible in English literature because they knew they had to understand the metaphors. Take my metaphor test on my website and you'll see you need to do some work in most cases to get to a reasonable level. So how amazing that they worked out what it was due to, and they're working on it to a degree. And of course, the church is growing faster than the Communist Party by a long way in China. I think the Chinese and the Koreans will probably be the salvation of the evangelical church in America. It could easily be. It would seem so to me. Now, what have we got wrong? Where have we lost our way? Well, those that go to medical school will be taught ethics using 4 categories: autonomy, justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. I don't know anyways. I call it the Georgetown mantra. It was first put together in Georgetown. Nobody teaches that those 4 things are ordered. Lewis says somewhere, and somebody who's good at searching can tell me where, because I can't find it now, but he says somewhere that most heresy is a good thing in a wrong place. Think about that. Most heresy is a good thing in a wrong place. Tolerance is a good example of that. Tolerance is not even a virtue, really, but we'll come to that in a moment. But the ordering of those goods, if you ask, Ross told me that his daughter was going to an ethics conference and she asked the question, what's the betting it will be all about autonomy? And in the modern world it is. But actually, autonomy, which all the students pretty well put first, is last. The right way round is the biblical way round. It starts with the 10 divine intolerances, right? See, we did get there in the end. Where's she gone? She's gone away to hide. Oh, well. You can rewrite the 10 Commandments as the 10 divine intolerances, can't you? Try it. It's not difficult. Why did God do that? Well, it is in fact legitimate intolerance that produces social stability. Can you see that? Let me give you an illustration which you will remember. It's true. I don't have to make them up like the bioethicists. I just have to think what's happened to me, and I have another illustration. This one I will never forget. Many years ago now, I was asked to give a talk in a Mennonite community in the prairies. It was spring, so it was only snowing gently, you know. We got there, and I gave my talk, and being a real community, 1,000 people, 500 turned up for the lecture. Whereas in a university now, a Nobel Prize winner sometimes only gets a dozen people. We've lost our sense of community. So I gave my talk, and of course, as always, I went on too long. But the guy who invited me said, it's too late to go back to Winnipeg tonight, you better stay with us. So we drove to his home. So he drove his nice Lexus and pushed it into the garage, didn't lock the garage, left the ignition key in the car. We went into the house and he pushed the door to, wasn't locked. He said, your room's the one at the top of the stairs, it's late, do you need anything? I couldn't resist. I said, isn't leaving the ignition key in the car a trifle careless? It is, after all, a Lexus. And he shrugged and said, oh, you never know who may need it. That is true freedom, isn't it? That's much greater freedom than you get with a satellite tracking device and an alarm. If you live in a community where you know that nobody's going to steal, you don't have to lock anything. One old lady on that trip said to me, I would like to have a front door key once in my life. Even when they go on holiday in that community, they don't lock the door, because if somebody needed something, they'd have to break a window. That's stupid. Leave it open, then they can get it. They teach thou shalt not steal is not an imposition, it's a gift. They teach it in church, they teach it in school, they teach it at home, and the government's smart enough to leave them alone. They're also one of the communities that has the highest charitable giving ratio in Canada. That's what legitimate intolerance does. So when you go to school, you've got to be able to stand up in front of your class and say, I am intolerant, and I think I can prove that you are too. And find a less politically incorrect way of doing it, but I can never resist it. I've even done this in a law school, and I've known there's some members of this organisation in the audience, but I love living dangerously sometimes, but I've never got into trouble yet. One day I will. I'll probably end up in prison, but who cares? Anyway, I would say to the students on my first lecture in biochemistry, part of it was to get rid of people who were politically correct, because I didn't want them in the class. And I would say, you will find me to be an intolerant professor. And the body language tightens up immediately. I see you think I should take Remedial Tolerance 101, but before I do, I want you to do a thought experiment for me. How many of you know what NAMBLA stands for? Some of you do, I know, but not many in an innocent place like Blacksburg. Well, if you put it into Google, you'll get to the North American Man-Boy Love Association, founded by a Catholic priest who thought that sodomy between adult men and prepubertal boys can be an enjoyable experience. Some of the Greeks thought the same. Almost certainly Plato did. Their slogan used to be 8 is too late. I think they've modified it a bit now because they found that people don't like paedophilia because it's not philia. Anyway, I say to them, now I want you to imagine that in a few years' time, you've got 8-year-old boys, and you have wished on you as a house guest because of your job, a young man who, when he arrives, turns out to be a member of NAMBLA. He's charming, he's funny, he even cooks, he's a wonderful house guest. And the kids love him because he plays creatively. But are you going to allow this mid-20s trendy young man to persuade your 8-year-olds that they're missing out on the rights of all 8-year-olds and that sodomy is something they would enjoy? Raise your hand if you would. Nobody ever has. And I say, welcome to the ranks of the intolerant. I have found something you will not tolerate. Now we have the much more important question, is your intolerance justified? And I put it to you that it is, and it's justified on grounds of love. You have every right to say, our understanding of what is loving for those boys is rooted in 8 years of sacrificial care. After all, they are still alive. He's been there for 10 minutes. He has no right to usurp that. None whatsoever. Nothing to be ashamed of. He's got lots to be ashamed of. And some of them drop the class. That's perfect. But they don't answer back because they can't. Tolerance is not a virtue. It gets close, but it's not. The best way, put Dorothy Sayers and tolerance into Google and you will get a 2-sentence rhetorical overdrive on tolerance, which is brilliant. And I won't try. I haven't got it in front of me at the moment, so I won't try to do it by memory because I can't match Dorothy Sayers. It's from a paper she wrote many, many years ago on the, I think it's called The 7 Deadly Sins or something like that. But her dismissal of tolerance is superb. The last line is, they only remain alive because there is nothing they would die for. That's where tolerance ends, where nothing matters enough. It's the oil to make the machinery work, but the machinery are ideas of love and truth and honor and justice. They're the gears. They're the things that do the work. We need tolerance because we're all sinners. Christians, above all else, should understand what tolerance is for. We're all works in progress, aren't we? And we need to tolerate that, but only insofar as we also encourage one another to use the means of grace to make progress. We have a legitimate understanding of tolerance. Paul understood that. Now we see through a glass darkly. Then we shall understand as we are understood. We're incomplete. We're works in progress, so be patient with one another. But get the right things in the right place. Tolerance is just the oil. As a virtue, it's about 29th on the list of virtues, you know. The big ones are up there first. So when God gave the 10 Commandments to Israel, that was the greatest commencement speech of all time, Deuteronomy. I mean, if you're ever asked to do a commencement speech and you don't know what to say, just plagiarize Moses. I mean, you'll never do better than that. And what he's saying to the children of Israel is, you've got to understand the law as a gift. And he does that in both Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. What precedes the first intolerance? I will not tolerate any other gods except me. What precedes that? What's the sentence? It's the same in both Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. This is biblical illiteracy 101 again, isn't it? But I don't even ask for your forgiveness because I'm doing you a service when I make you feel guilty about biblical illiteracy.
Lord our God is one?
No. That comes after. That's in Deuteronomy 6. But you'll remember that now. You won't forget that something precedes the 10 Commandments, and you won't forget what it is. Yeah, that's partly right. Yeah, that's right. That bit is also important, isn't it? Did you hear what he said? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. Could they get out of Egypt on their own? No. So isn't it amazing? Grace introduces the law in both Deuteronomy and Exodus. God does not change his character between bringing them out of Egypt and saying thou shalt not. He's doing something very important. He's providing a framework. Amazingly, John Paul II got it in one sentence. He said the law is the framework within which freedom can happen. That's beautiful, isn't it? I don't think you can beat that. Write it down, memorize it, use it. You can even give credit. It'll do you good as evangelicals to give credit to a Catholic Pope. In fact, the Splendor of Truth, apart from the last chapter, which is about Mary, which I'm a Protestant, I haven't got anywhere near that, but it's a brilliant Bible study, actually, on the rich young ruler. I wonder, and if you've got Catholics who are liberal Catholics and have never met salvation, a good place to start is the Splendor of Truth, because they'll read it. It's the Pope, after all. And he never spoke to young people without ending his talk in the same way. He would say, we've talked about Catholicism, but the bottom line is you must have a meeting with Jesus. But neither he nor Benedict could get them off their backsides to evangelize. The real church, in my view, and many others, is evangelical Protestants and Orthodox Catholics. As one Catholic abbot put it to me more than 20 years ago, we ended up with my Catholic lawyer friend again, staying overnight at a Catholic abbey, and the abbot took one look at us and said, "You're very tired, have dinner with us." It was a silent meal with a guy reading missionary letters from the lectern. The next morning we had a 3-hour seminar with the abbot and his senior brothers. One of the best seminars I had in my life, as we went through the turning points in the intellectual history of the Western world. And at the end, he said, "I'm glad you're travelling with Ian. You might keep him in order." I did for a while, but not indefinitely. But he said, this guy rarely left the abbey, but he knew about what we were doing. He knew about me. And he said, "We pray for you." And he said, "We Orthodox Catholics need you evangelicals for your passion for the scriptures and your love of evangelism. And you need us because we've thought about every question you haven't." They did use those 1,500 years, between the end of the Acts of the Apostles and Martin Luther. They went very badly wrong along the way, but we've done that too. We go badly wrong regularly, and we need the correction of the Holy Spirit in whatever way it's necessary. But one of the things that blows the students away who come to Augustine is, of course, they've never read. Let's see how many of you have. How many of you have read Augustine's Confessions? That's very unusual. Everybody should read it, shouldn't they? In the end of the first paragraph, it's worth buying the book for that alone. Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. That's where it comes from. It's the first conversion story told in the first person. Amazing. Most of the ones who come have never read it, certainly not read it properly, and we spend a whole first term, one evening a week, we read the Confessions together. I mean, he gets close to quantum physics at one point. In a lovely line where he says, "I know what time is till someone asks me." I mean, he was so far ahead of the curve. They've certainly not read Bonaventure or Augustine or Fenelon, or people they should know about because they were great Christians. God trusted the Catholic Church with the story for 1,500 years. 10 minutes to go. Sorry, I'm going so slowly, but you're listening, so it's all right. God controls the speed, I hope. Certainly it seems like that to me with what follows. So the 10 commandments are the 10 divine intolerances, and they are the framework for freedom. And you can legislate the negatives, thou shalt not. You can't legislate positives, but you can understand the positives as the opposite, can't you? Thou shalt not kill can get to, in Jesus' mouth, love your enemy. There's a logical pathway from one to the other, the moral universe with its fixed dimensions. So, non-maleficence, thou shalt not, to thou shalt, beneficence, doing good. Now you have the possibility of justice. And the best legal scholars in America and the Western world know that we have a huge problem with justice. Abortion legislation is at the heart of it. The one dissenting judge in the Roe v. Wade decision said, "This is not about justice. This is raw judicial power." That is the first statement I know in legal history where a judge points that out. That in America, with the Roe v. Wade decision, the really important thing that happened was that law had got lost. It had become the pursuit of power rather than the pursuit of justice. Now, here's where my golden rule: find an atheist to make your difficult statements. On this particular occasion, it is in fact an unbelieving Jew from Yale called Arthur Leff, L-E-F-F. You can put Leff and justice into Google, and if you remember it, Duke Law Review 1979, and you'll be there. Leff taught law at Yale, was a much-loved teacher, but he was worried about lawyers in the 1970s. And by 1979, he was willing to try out his ideas. And the opening paragraph is so good I can paraphrase it for you. He says, I want to believe, and so do you, in a complete immanent, that's a technical term, not imminent next week, but immanent, meaning accessible to you, comprehensible by you. Immanent and transcendent set of propositions about right and wrong, findable rules that direct us as to how to live our lives righteously. He's talking about the Ten Commandments. He's talking about Torah. And he wants Torah to be true, to be from God, transcendent, and accessible by us. Why? Because he knows that if there is no such transcendent law, then what basis does a Darwinian judge have for being just? He doesn't have one. And they are increasingly making the law to suit their own purposes. That's what the elite that you threw out in the last election have been doing to blue-collar people for most of my lifetime. You know, I have huge sympathy with that because I watched my family destroyed in England from being men who were proud of what they could do to being mere machine minders with their dignity stripped by globalization. I don't know what the solutions are, but the first one is to start recognizing that you can't treat some people as a bunch of deplorables, as Hillary put it. She lost the election, I'm sure, at that moment, and she deserved to, because a whole group of people who hadn't voted in the 4 previous elections voted. That we haven't thought about it. In Britain, the church lost the working class at the beginning of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, the early 1900s. The street where I grew up of 400 houses, I only know of 2 families that went to church. America's different, but as Colson put it, your Christianity is a few thousand miles wide and a couple of inches deep. That's got to change because times are getting tougher. So Leff goes on, he says, but I also want to believe in no such thing as an immanent and transcendent set of propositions about right and wrong, but rather that we are wholly free to decide for ourselves what we ought to do and what we ought to be. What we want, heaven help us, is to be perfectly free and perfectly ruled. That is at the same time to discover the right and the good and to invent it. You cannot have both. And increasingly, you're choosing, certainly in the universities, to say that law is a human construct. If it is, we're in trouble. And of course, we know it isn't. I was talking to Don about the way language is present in our brains before we speak. I love watching this in my grandchildren. I have 20 plus, so I have lots to watch. My favorite first philosophical statement is one you've all heard. Not fair. They say it before they've got complete sentences. Now, I could write a book with the title Not Fair. They understand justice before they understand grammar. It's hardwired. It's not present in my cows. I have a herd of 40 Hereford cattle, so I watch the calves who do not live in an environment where you can say not fair. Or you can say it, or you can moo it, but no account will be taken of it. That's the difference. The difference between the nearest ape and me is unbridgeable. And it's unbridgeable in precisely this area of the immaterial goods we understand and they don't. Leff understood that. Then he writes 20 pages of lucid prose. He wants you to understand. He's not playing academic games. And he ends brilliantly. He says this, he's at Yale in the 1970s, social Darwinianism, you can't buck it. So he gives in. But he's Jewish. He still has his riders. He says, it looks to me as though we are all that we have. Darwin's right. But looking around the world, he said, this is an extraordinarily unappetizing prospect. Only if the law was unnatural and unspeakable by us would it be unchallengeable. As things stand now, everything is up for grabs. And then he writes a plaintive last two sentences. He says, nevertheless, starving the poor is wicked. Buying and selling each other is depraved. There is in this world such a thing as evil. He just said there wasn't. He knew what he should do. He should have rewritten the penultimate paragraph to say, because we all know that buying and selling each other is depraved, that starving the poor is wrong. Because we know that, it looks to me as though we cannot be all that we have. It's an argument for God. And he knew it. As far as I know, he never again attempted a lecture on the philosophy of justice. And of course, we don't have any discussions in church. But these are the issues we need to talk about, and we need to think our way through, and we need to be able to make the arguments, because we can do it. You need to develop legitimate intolerance and be able to talk about it. Now, I've touched on the sanctity of life. I'm going to finish. I've got 2 minutes. Obviously, I'm not going to talk about it. Abortion was a central part of my life in that I was pro-choice for 20 years. Pro-choice because of rubella babies. In the 1960s, when I was doing infectious diseases, every now and again we would see a woman who got a rash, and she'd say, is this German measles? Because you don't know that anymore, because it's not a risk to you. All the women in particular, and boys too, have been inoculated against rubella. And a huge, horrible problem, rubella syndrome, doesn't happen anymore. But the syndrome was horrendous. If you were pregnant and you got rubella at the wrong time, you are facing anything up to a 90% probability of a child with major cardiac and or neurological problems. Not nice news to have to tell a mum. What we were trained to do, and what I did, because I'd become a reductionist, a problem solver, principles are pushed to one side, outcomes are all that mattered. We said, this pregnancy's gone wrong, hasn't it? And of course they said yes. Would you like to start again? Yes. We can make that happen. You have to come into hospital briefly and then you can start again. We never used the word abortion, but that's what it was. It was on the OR list as a D&C, and I felt no guilt. That's the key. I had succumbed to life driven by feeling instead of life driven by thought. Now, I should have known better, but I didn't. In fact, I didn't learn until many years later from Benedict, who's always worth reading. He was the first person to point out that there are two words for conscience in the Christian tradition. One means moral feeling, and the other means moral thought. Which one is the more reliable? It's a no-brainer. Your moral feelings are often wrong. If you sit down and do the work and think it through, the outcome is almost invariably right. We don't have those two words in English, we only have one, so it's confused. I didn't sit down and think about it for another 20 years. Once I did, it took one afternoon, that's all. It's this period of my life where God was getting on my track from every direction. There was nowhere to turn. I was being chased by the hand of heaven into what came next. And I left my laboratory that afternoon. I didn't know why. I shut my office door and said, leave me alone. And I asked myself the question, can I think that a woman wants to have an abortion? And by the end of the afternoon, I knew that I couldn't. I also knew that the argument was probably watertight. I tried it out on Robert Spitzer, who teaches quantum physics and theology, a Jesuit who I admire greatly, and he said, that's good, it will work, try it. I said, I have no desire to try it. I hoped you'd find a hole in it and let me off. I still wasn't willing. My wife had set up a website, and that gets me into trouble all the while. And shortly after this, the students from Wayne State called and said, we see you're going to Ann Arbor. You have to go through Detroit. Will you talk to us on the way? I said, sure. What do you want me to do? And they said, we want you. It will be January the 23rd, right? Is that the date of Roe v. Wade? I think it's 23rd. Anyway, it was the date of the Roe v. Wade decision. They said, we want you to talk about abortion in Wayne State medical school in the middle of the day. And I said, I don't do that. And they said, why? I said, I've no desire to be lynched in public. And they said, but we think you could do it. We've heard you talk. And I said, flattery will get you nowhere. And then they said, we've been praying about it. And I knew it was going to happen. And so I said, all right, make sure there's an escape hatch by the lectern and take me to Ann Arbor immediately after the lecture. I didn't need to bother. The lecture ended in dead silence, as it has done every time since. And that's included Harvard and Oxford and St. Petersburg, Sydney, you name it. Wisconsin, Minnesota, always silence. And never a single aggressive question. Why? Because we frame the question wrongly. The first thing to establish with any audience is that there is no moral consensus. With medical students, it's easy. All I have to do is say, if I said to you that within weeks of starting medical school, there were people in your class about whom you decided you would never trust the care of a dog of yours to them, what would you say? And the little ironic smile goes all the way around the room. I say it immediately. It's not a laugh. It's just, yeah, that's true. And I say, I can see that you agree with me. What about the next question? If we took a vote about the ones you don't trust, would there be a consensus? The answer is yes. The students know within 6 weeks there are some people in the class who ought not to be there for the good of medicine, the good of patients. The faculty never have a clue. When they lose their license 5-10 years after graduation, nobody in their class is surprised. But there's no evidence on their transcript that this was going to happen. But you know the character of the people you live with for 4 years. And you know some of them shouldn't be doctors. So that's step one. So say, they're not here today, I presume, and they'll not. No, they haven't come. One or two may be there, and they're in for a very hard time over the next 45 minutes. So say, well, what we're here to discuss today is a moral issue, isn't it? Because the question is, what, if any, duties do we owe to the unborn? That's a moral question. It cannot be answered by science. You cannot get to value judgments, I don't like the term value judgment, moral judgments from physical facts. There is no pathway from one to the other. That's what the whole of Lewis's Abolition of Man is really about. The best book he ever wrote. Men Without Chests. So, there's no way to do that. So, we are now entered the realm of philosophy and theology. Now, let's ask you another question. If we take out questions of life and death and sexuality, do you agree, trust one another for the rest of the medicine that you practice, that it will be ethical? And the answer is yes. But the moment we insert life and death and sexuality, there's no possibility of agreement. In fact, there's a line down the middle, very close to 50-50, slightly more pro-choice because there's a pro-choice bias in getting into medical school. If you want to get in, you should say you're pro-choice. You up your possibility of getting in quite dramatically. You don't have to say what the choice is about. I'm very pro-choice, I say. Perfectly true. I don't add, except under my breath, in the case of abortion, 2 choices. That's the question. Now, so the real question, it turns out not to be abortion at all. The real question is, what would you need to believe to be an ethical abortionist? And what would you need to believe to be an ethical anti-abortionist? And then what you have to do next, there's not time to do this, but if you want, the whole thing takes about an hour. It's available on CD. It's on my website, I think downloadable for free. It's meant to be. And if it's not, you can tell my webmaster and he will fix that. But it has a title that's not immediately obvious for obvious reasons. It's Pursuing Justice for the Unborn. It ends in silence every time. The first thing you do is what Thomas tells you to do. You make their case better than they can make it first. So I make the pro-choice case, which is usually, not anymore, but in my day, rooted in a horrendous medical experience. People who had a backstreet abortion often died horrendously of a septically induced acute renal failure before dialysis. This was not good news. If you've seen one, you never want to see another. I've known many Christian doctors who became pro-abortion over that issue. And I would say for a secularist, abortion is a rational decision. You can talk to him about that afterwards if you want to. But not for us. But you make their case better than they can make it, and then they relax. And then you say, but on the other hand, and I call it the domino effect of Roe v. Wade. I'll just tell you the things that have happened because of it. First, for you, a human being and a human person are the same thing. Not for bioethicists anymore. Those two had to be pulled apart in order to rationalize abortion. But once you'd started, there was no way that the argument wouldn't carry the abortion first from the first 22 weeks to partial birth abortion and then to infanticide. Peter Kraft once said to me, he said, beware of being as clinically accurate as you are, because they will come to you as they've come to me. And he just a week or two before this conversation, he'd had two young women in Harvard come up to him and say, thank you, Professor Kraft, for that lecture. I see that infanticide is necessary. I was worried about it before. So that extension occurred, of course. But once you've got to infanticide, what about Alzheimer's? What about if you got herpes encephalitis and an IQ of 50 tomorrow morning? The idea of a life not worth living is a rational outcome of abortion. We're already practicing eugenics, and we're going to get rid of compassion and become an even more selfish, navel-gazing society. It even led to the animal rights movement. It led to the destruction of justice. Perhaps the worst one in many ways, I don't know, they're all bad, but the last one that's really horrendous is what it does to compassion. The last clinic I ran was for severely disabled children. Some of them, to be kind to them, were not pretty to look at. On one occasion, just before I stopped doing clinical medicine, a woman came in and she'd clearly been crying. And I said, what's the matter? And she said, a woman on the bus looked at my baby and said, why didn't you have that thing aborted? How nasty can we be? And I said, well, I think I can explain what that woman was doing in her head, and it might make you feel a little better. I suspect that she had had an abortion for an essentially trivial reason, like getting pregnant unexpectedly when she was looking forward to a Caribbean holiday and she wanted to wear a bikini without a bump. People have abortions for that reason. And then she sees you pouring your life into this child, and she had a huge guilt trip, so she lashed out. That's where we're at. Our moral decisions are all consequential, and we've got to learn to make that argument. The best account of it is Budziszewski's wonderful book, What We Can't Not Know. How many of you have read that one? Just a few. So you need to get that book. It's an amazing book, What We Can't Not Know. Lovely double negative. We can't not know that killing is wrong. We can't not know that stealing is wrong. We can't not know something like the Ten Commandments is true. And he does it brilliantly. That if you don't read anything else, read the chapter on the avenge of the furies. Because we know what sin is, even though we no longer can name it because we don't believe in objective moral truth. And so people who go down that track, they get twisted along the way. He's got some wonderful accounts of that because his wife ran a pregnancy distress centre. And people get themselves tied up in such knots. One woman came along and her marriage wasn't doing well, in part because they hadn't been able to get pregnant. And then she got pregnant, but she found out at the same time that her husband was cheating on her. So she had an abortion of a wanted baby to punish her husband. But after she'd done that, she felt so guilty, she got pregnant again, then had another abortion to punish herself. And that's how twisted we get when we depart from the story of meaning that made our lives livable. He does a wonderful job on that process of making us see, and you can make the world see. So I've already gone over time. So do we take a break or what? You take a break. The life of the mind has been neglected in the church for a long while. In an Anglican church you go to an Anglican church to be nice. That's what they train you to be. You probably know the story in England that the Salvation Army picks you up in the gutter and they hand you over to the Baptists who baptize you, who hand you over to the Presbyterians who educate you, who hand you over to the Anglicans who make you nice, and then the Salvation Army picks you up in the gutter again. It's got more than a germ of truth in it, unfortunately, but nevertheless. I can actually get away with this in an Anglican church. Actually, I'm preaching in an Anglican church tomorrow. I must not do it there. But in order to get their attention, I will ask the question, why were the epistles written? And nobody offers an answer, ever. And of course, they were written because the church had what I call negative talent. Many students have it. If you've got it, it means you think of the answer and then say the opposite, and you'll be more often right. And the church got things wrong with monotonous regularity, so the result was that the apostles had to write letters, basically about very particular problems. So you could say Corinthians was written because the church was in sexual disarray. We've reached a stage where we need Corinth again. The Romans needed their thinking straightening out. The Galatians were so Presbyterian that the Holy Spirit was no longer welcome, and the Thessalonians thought, well, Jesus is coming again, I don't need to work. So it went on. So each of the epistles has a very practical reason, and Paul thinks that theology can sort those problems out. And then he says something like this. He'll say, if you've followed my argument, then you ought not to be like the people around you. You need to be transformed by the renewal of your feelings. And I can get away with that in an Anglican church. And I've got away with it with quite a lot of you, because all I've done is trash the intellectual history of the Western world in one sentence, and you don't really seem to care. How many of you noticed what I did? About half, yeah. Want a second try? Paul says, if you followed my argument, then you ought not to be like the people around you. You need to be transformed by the renewal of your feelings. Mind, that's right. Yeah, I mean, it ought to have been obvious given the title of this talk, right? But we actually go to church to feel better. Most of the people in church tomorrow will be there to feel better. That's not the reason. You go to church to think better. And when you do that, you usually feel terrible. You will feel good when God wants to do that to you. That's his province, not yours. You feel good when you are obedient. When you know that he looks upon you with pleasure. That's beyond the price of rubies. But all the epistles have that thought in them. They're all about it. Now let me take it a step further. Paul says in another epistle, to those that are perishing, the preaching of the cross is foolishness, but to those who have been saved, it is the power of God. Now, I have truncated the passage and paraphrased it a little, but again, I have made a very significant error. How many of you know what it is? Oh, no one this time. So listen more carefully. Paul says the preaching of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who have been saved, it is the power of God. One at the back so far. A few more, yeah. It was my accent, I know. You really understood, yeah. But you see the problem. There's still only 2 or 3. Want a third go? Paul says the preaching of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to those who have been saved, it is the power of God. Yes, more of you. It's our being saved, present continuous. Have you ever heard anyone in church say, has anybody got witness this week to the way you have been saved as an ongoing process this week? I've never heard that in church. Have you? It should be a question every week, in my view, because we're concerned with the growth of the church, and this is the growth of the mind of the church. Now, I can put my finger on multiple times when that happened to me. Now, God uses amazing people. One of the key players in my move from my ivory tower to what I do now was a radical homosexual Jew in the University of Chicago who taught Aristotle, Plato, and the Greeks dominantly. He was probably the best teacher of Aristotle that North America had over the last half century or so. His name was Alan Bloom. Somebody, at least in this weekend, has said, I bought The Closing the American Mind because of hearing you say this. You only need read the first chapter, by the way. Alan Bloom wrote the book, The Closing the American Mind, in the late 80s. I remember buying it because I knew it was causing waves in the university, because he was basically saying the American education system is wrecked. This was in the 80s. It hasn't got better. And I was on my way to Africa. I thought it would last me the flight. It didn't. It lasted a year. But not reading. I only really needed the first chapter. Now, the first chapter is called The Empty Slate. And the empty slate is you, if you're a student. You arrive at university, basically, from his point of view, as an empty slate. Something to write on. And he didn't want to do that. He wanted somebody to come who'd already got a lot of material in place, which he said, they don't have it anymore. And towards the end of that first chapter, about a couple of paragraphs from the end of the chapter, there's an extremely beautiful paragraph. Bloom was a third-generation Jew in America. And his grandparents had arrived with nothing. They had worked in the sweatshops. His parents' generation owned sweatshops. And as he put it, classic Jewish success story, he and all his cousins were MDs or PhDs. In 3 generations, they were all in academia, all with higher degrees. But what he says is amazing. He says, then he starts reminiscing, and he says, my grandparents were humble folk. They never went inside an institution of higher learning. But everything done in their home was spiritually rich. They found reasons for the performance of their duties and the bearing of their sorrows by reference to the book, the Old Testament. And they could go to the synagogue, where they heard great scholars who spoke not from an alien perspective, but from the same perspective, while simply going deeper and providing guidance. That, says Bloom, is what a community is. I think it's the best definition of community I know. A community invites high and low into a common story of meaning. That's what the Bible is, a common story of meaning. And the young generation are hungry for meaning at the moment. You put meaning in a title, you get a crowd. Because the modern education system provides no meaning. Nothing worth living for. Now, the next paragraph really blew me away. He says, when I look at my cousins, all of whom have MDs or PhDs, they have no wisdom comparable to that of my grandparents. When they speak of the meaning of life, the relationship between husbands and wives, parents and children, they speak in the language of cliché. No depth. I couldn't believe it. My take on Bloom's book is not the one that most academics will put forward because they don't like it, but I'm sure I'm right. What Bloom was saying, that passage about his grandparents makes it absolutely clear. He says elsewhere, a great society must have a great book. All great societies are made out of a common great book. That's why the Muslims hold together, because they have only the Quran. They don't translate anything. I mean, more books are translated into Spanish each year than into Arabic. They haven't won a Nobel Prize for a long while. And the ones that do win, in the end, they tried to take Peter Medawar, who was distantly Islamic, but he wasn't Islamic at all. His idea of a really funny cricket match was he got a Nobel Prize for immunology and ran the MRC unit in Mill Hill in London, and he had an annual cricket match. And they want to call him a Muslim. The way it worked is every time you scored a run, you had to drink half a pint of beer. I mean, in about 2 hours, everybody was lying on the ground, sleeping it off. You know, that's the way it worked. Muslim? No, not at all. He had a Muslim heritage, but it wasn't his Muslim heritage that made him a scientist. It was his education in England. So Bloom recognizes that cultures have a great book. There are really only 6 great stories and 2 heresies in the world. They all fit in one of those categories. The oldest story of all, as Chesterton beautifully points out, is animistic paganism. Now, I'm not using that as a pejorative term, simply as descriptive. an animistic pagan society believes that the world is explained by evil spirits. They may have a distant view of a creator, but it's not a creator they know, and it's certainly not a creator who loves them. Now, the bit of Africa we know well. To get to many of the villages that I spent a lot of time in, we had to walk for half a day through the rainforest. Now, you stop in the middle of a rainforest and try and tell wise but uneducated Africans that this happened by chance, they will not believe you, quite rightly. It is such a spectacularly beautiful place, like few other places on earth. No, of course not. But they don't believe that this is a God of love because half their children die before maturity. Their crops fail apparently at random. And in the country we knew, it was Zaire and then DRC, they've had some of the worst governments in the world for the last 40 years. And the last 20 years in the bit that we know has been a civil war. There's not much evidence for a God of love in that story. And yet the church is growing, as it always does. That's amazing, because it has answers in a difficult situation. But the pagan world produces pagan ethics. Now, the way that the mind is formed ethically starts very early in life. You should get Don to talk to you about this at some time if you've never heard him talk, because he knows more about this than I do. But I've already mentioned my grandchildren and their philosophical insights. Children come into the world hardwired with a lot of things. There's a lot there that we don't understand, and the more you know about children, the better it is. When Bruce Waltke introduced me to Deuteronomy 6 as the heart of Judaism and the reason for their success, much to my delight, a couple of years later at Regent College, where Mark went, for 2 years in a row, they put on a conference where they paired one of the theologians from Regent College with a physician from the Christian Medical Dental Association. And to my delight, I was paired with Bruce Waltke. And so I said to him the first time, they're going to get Bruce Waltke twice this morning, once for real and once plagiarized by me, because he'd really got to me with some lectures he gave in Ottawa. But he was fascinated because he hadn't thought about it the way that a pediatrician does. He knew that Deuteronomy 6 provided the structure for the way Jews raise their children, but he hadn't thought about it in terms of ethics in the same way. Now, I need to ask you a question, and before I tell you the answer, I will know whether you read to children or not, because this is a very important question. What is the difference between the response of an under 5 and the response of a 7 upwards child, in my case grandchildren, but children too, to the question, would you like a story? Well, the answer is always yes. Now, but what's the difference between the two groups? Well, I'll tell you my answer, and by watching your faces, I'll know how many of you read to children. The 7-year-old will bring you the book she's in the middle of and will milk you for as many chapters as you will read. They'll turn off television, they'll stop playing games on their computer for mom, dad, or granny or granddad to read to them. For children, that's the best entertainment that's available. I can picture my wife sitting for 2 or 3 hours reading to grandchildren. And they don't have anything they enjoy more. But the under 5s, even in our house, they have their own shelf. And they go and get a book from that shelf. Now, if they bring it to me, I get bored very easily. Now, some of you read to children. I can see that already because you've worked out what's coming next. As one of them said not long ago, as I tried to shorten his favourite book. Yeah. Grandad, have you forgotten how to read? You know. The little guy's brought me a book he knows every word of. So why on earth does he want me to read it? What's going on? Now, this is present in every culture I've visited, and I've visited most of them by now. They all have children who want word-perfect stories. But the stories are different. In animistic Africa, the stories are common ones, and they go all across the sub-Saharan band, and they come across with the slave trade to the Caribbean and up into the American South. And they are stories in which a little animal beats a big animal by trickery. Does that explain quite a lot of behavior? Sure it does. And Nancy the spider always wins. Or the rabbit. So a con man is a hero in Jamaica and in Nigeria. They told me I've been to Nigeria quite a few times. They said, well, if we send out 6,000 or so emails to America, some of you will have had them. My evangelical husband died recently and left a lot of money in the bank, and I've been looking for a good evangelical to transfer the money to, and your name's been given to me. Please send me your bank account number and I'll transfer the money. And 1 in 6,000 Americans will buy it, and in the morning their bank account is empty. And they can live for a year on that. And they're not ashamed of it, because a con man is a hero. In fact, you can play the game, and given my penchant for playing those sorts of games, I do. The last time I was in Nigeria, a doctor lent me his driver and his car, and I went to, I think, all but 2 medical schools in about 2 weeks and spoke in all of them. And most of them, the dean introduced me, and often introduced me praying in tongues. They're very charismatic, very Pentecostal, and very shallow. But they know their Bibles. The Nigerians are much more biblically literate than Americans are. Anyway, amazingly, we hadn't been stopped at a roadblock until on our way back to the airport. And we were stopped. Well, it didn't surprise me. I expected it many times before that, but it hadn't. And they came to my driver and asked for his documents, and at this point I discovered that his documents were not in order. That for them was a great success, so they hauled him out of the car. But I also knew he had no money, because I'd paid all the bills. So I knew that it wouldn't be very long before they came to my window to extort money from me. And I was in the kind of mood where I thought, I'll see if I can win. And sure enough, they shortly arrived at my window. And so I laid it on with a spade. I said, you're going to take my driver away. I've been teaching in your medical schools, trying to improve your health system for 2 weeks. I've done it for no money to Nigeria. And now I'm on the way back to the airport, and you're going to make me miss my plane. What kind of image of Nigeria am I going to take back to Canada, etc., etc., etc.? I laid it on thick. And they gave in. They said, we'd better let you go. And so we got away. But I knew this wouldn't be the end of it, because they have CB radios. They love this sort of thing. So I knew that we'd be stopped again. And when we're stopped, the guys already knew what I'd done on the first occasion, so I'd better be prepared for step 2. And they were thinking about it too. And sure enough, it happened. This time, it wasn't just the ordinary hoi polloi soldier who came, but the guy with the brass buttons who was in charge of the roadblock. And he didn't start by saying, my driver was about to lie. I said, don't lie. They know you don't have the right documents. And they hauled him off. And the guy was, the boss said, they discovered a little bit about me from the previous one. So he said, we're in a very difficult situation. But do you know Matthew 5 at all? And I said, I have a passing knowledge of Matthew 5. And he says that it says there, if your enemy wants to take you to court, you should settle with him on the way. I said, it does indeed. Do you know what it says a little later? Silence. I said, it says, what shall a man give in exchange for his soul? You are about to exchange your soul for a measly bribe. Is that a good move? And he said, you better go. And we were not stopped again. But he will dine out on that story, because they love those kinds of stories. That's the culture. They don't feel that cheating's wrong. It's your fault for not detecting it. So, amazingly, Nigeria is a very happy place. And it's also a totally corrupt place. In fact, there was not long ago, some sort of sociologist group were discussing which was the happiest country in the world. In the end, they decided Nigeria was. And the joke in Nigeria was, who paid for that? That's a pagan society. It will work in a village, but it will not work beyond a village. It is a culture for a village. Because the chief in a village has to maintain his position by dispensing some sort of justice. They know that he will take the best bit of land, that he will have the best cattle, but If you've ever had the privilege of being in a village, when they have something to sort out, they'll sit and talk for 2 days. And the chief won't say a word. He'll just listen. And when everybody has spoken, he's got to sum up in a way that will carry the village with him if he's going to remain chief. So it's a subtle job. But if you elect him to go and live in the big city, forget it. He's not going to bother about the village anymore. He's going to be looking for ways to make money, and he does. I mean, isn't it amazing? Arab Moi and Mobutu were in the top 5 richest men in the world in their time, basically ripping off from their own people. That a pagan society cannot develop. It doesn't have the intellectual substructure. That's what I had to learn about the work we did on malnutrition. Sure, we went through 100 £10 2-year-olds in the late 1970s and saved every single one. In other words, we'd done the science and the treatment was counterintuitive. But there hasn't been a successful nutrition education program in Africa yet, sub-Saharan Africa. There will be. But as long as their default is to animistic paganism, there's no foundation for nutrition education. It's much easier to explain the death of children by the action of evil spirits. It's a much better explanatory model. And that's all you need. You need answers to the existential questions of life. And all cultures do that. But animists do it by fatalism. They accept life. So even in the refugee camps, antidepressants didn't move. They didn't need antidepressants. Once they were in the refugee camps, they shrugged and got on with where it was. That sort of stoicism that comes with fatalism will help you cope with a refugee camp. Whereas in our society, where we're living on the dregs of Christianity, we're committing suicide at increasing rates because we're in a very incoherent situation. We don't know how to put ourselves together. We don't have the framework anymore. So that's the oldest story of all. Then you can divide the stories between East and West, and the mind in each place will develop in different ways. Now, the big difference between East and West is the West, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, have the story of the fall. They believe in sin. The East doesn't believe in that in the same way. They believe much more in going into their own minds. So you have meditation techniques coming out of the East. But in the West, given the fall, it makes more sense to investigate God's world and learn something about God from doing that. There's a very key difference. I mean, Indians, for instance, they spent lots of money on research. They do very well in Cambridge and Oxford and America, but they don't do well in India. Fatalism gets in the way. Fatalism always gets in the way. Even within the West, the most fatalistic are the Muslims, and the least fatalistic are the Jews, and in between you've got Catholics and Protestants, with Catholics a bit more fatalistic than Protestants. And that actually shows up in the World Bank data on protein energy malnutrition. They don't realize what they've published, of course, but they use protein energy malnutrition rates as an inverse indication of development, or lack of it. So the highest rates are in animistic societies, then Hindus, then Buddhists, then Muslims, then Catholics, then Protestants, and then Jews. Now, the Protestant bit doesn't have to mean that you're going to church. It just means that you inhabit the Protestant story for a while, and it's non-fatalistic. So, for instance, Hitler induced a lot of malnutrition in Holland in the Second World War because they wouldn't kill handicapped people. Even when they refused, and his leader in Holland executed a few of the leading physicians, they didn't stop. They simply looked after the widows and orphans. And because the Third Reich needed the Dutch doctors, they had to stop. So the only place, other than Denmark, which was a different account, that had a significant number of handicapped children at the end of the Second World War in the Third Reich was Holland. But he starved them. So when the Allies liberated Holland, they set up a committee to decide how best to correct this situation. The committee didn't even meet before malnutrition had gone, because as soon as the supply of food increased a little, it was given out in a rational way. starting with breastfeeding mothers, then pregnant mothers, then children, then men last. Whereas in an animistic society, men feed first, and take the best food, and the children come last. Because fatalism accepts there's a high infant mortality, just the way it is. Different mindset, different story leads to different outcomes. Now we're in a post-Christian period now, to a large degree. And the two Christian heresies that have infected the Western world are, of course, capitalism and Marxism. They're both the same heresy. They would both be fine if one Christian doctrine was untrue. Which doctrine is that? It's the fall. If we were not sinners, capitalism would be fine. But if we were not sinners, communism would be fine. But we are sinners, so neither of them are safe. You cannot have Adam Smith's economics if you don't have Adam Smith's ethics. And Adam Smith was a dull Presbyterian. We need a lot more dull Presbyterians. It's a huge problem. Now, I've done a lot of talking in the last couple of weeks. Have I talked about Robert Fogel to you? Yes, for one, but you're about the only one that seems to think. I did, yeah, that you did. Okay, that will remind them. But Fogel, the economist at Chicago, realized that the problem for the system of economics is, in fact, trust. And amazingly, there's another wonderful place that you can get this idea, again, from a non-Christian, therefore gold, and that's Niall Ferguson, who teaches at both Harvard and Oxford. And in his book, Civilization, the subtitle is a giveaway, The West and the Rest. Only if you're teaching at Oxford and Harvard can you get away with a subtitle like that, because it's very politically incorrect, isn't it? The West and the Rest. Now, you open the book and he talks about, I think it's the 6 acts of development. And I looked at the list. I said, that's all old hat. That can't be what the book's about. You know, things like the process of law, rights of property, all the things that we've taken for granted and are now being eroded in the West. But he couldn't write the book for that reason. So I was looking for what was the real motivation for the book, and he found out about 2/3 of the way through it when he's in China. And he gets 2 Chinese groups of scholars to tell him what China thinks the answer is. The same question we'd got 25 years earlier. And these scholars had been hired by the Chinese government to find out why the West was successful. And they go through the list of things that you might think: the banking system, science, the military, and they dismissed them one by one, and then they said, it's your religion. The Chinese have no doubt that it was Christianity that made the success of the West possible. And they can't understand why we are trashing it. And we as Christians don't make the case that, look, you're throwing away the baby with the bathwater. Yeah, the church has done many things wrong and it's been stupid in many ways, but there are essential insights there that make all the difference in the world. And the place where it's going to show up most for you in your church is now, within a few years, the whole of America will have legalized euthanasia. I mean, I know that one of the Dakotas turned it down. They'll be the last to go. They were silly to do it in Dakota if they want to do it next. The sequence is well laid out, you know. The West Coast, Oregon and Washington and Montana have already moved. Vermont will move. That's already done so. Then they'll take Massachusetts and down the coast, and then it will just spread because we don't have sufficient intellectual muscle power to oppose it. And the only thing that can save us is another awakening of some sort, and I think that might happen. But your church needs to be thinking seriously about this, because you need a group that looks after old people in particular. A living will can kill you, because it's already been demonstrated in court that if you sign a living will that says, I do not wish to be placed on a respirator, and then you have an acute drug reaction causing laryngeal spasm, shall we say, and you need to go on a respirator for 24 hours and then you'll come off. If you do that and save their life and they're cynical, they can sue you and they'll win. So doctors are going to obey your rules because they may not want to do so, but as long as you've written it, they will be safe. That's why you need a power of attorney program in your church, so that 3 or 4 people are trained how to deal with these issues and can go to the intensive care unit when you're there. Because when you get old, there's a lot of defensive medicine. Ross, what percentage of medicine in the ICU do you think is defensive these days? A substantial amount, yeah. No doctor enjoys doing it. So if somebody comes up with due power of attorney and says, this patient is at peace with their God and would like to die at home, let's disconnect, see how far we can get them. Certainly they don't need to die here in an expensive bed. We can move them to another one, and if possible, get them home. We need to start dying as Christians again, not being tarted up by the death industry to look as though we're 24. It's crazy. Be like the Orthodox, who have an open casket and children go and kiss Granny goodbye, and Dad and Mum can say, that's not Granny, is it? And the children can see the difference. Granny's got a new body now. That's just Granny's body. It's a good way, good thing to do, but we have forgotten how to die. We have 3 opportunities, really, to get to the community out there, and that's if you have a christening or infant baptism program, marriages and deaths. So you better make sure that the gospel is preached at all 3 of those. That's the only opportunity many people are going to have. The mind has got decayed to that vast degree. Now, what happened, I can't say chronologically next, one of the other important events that happened to me in this process was coming across 4 lines written 8 centuries ago, which really put me back on my heels. They were written by Bernard of Clairvaux, and he wrote this. He said, there are some who seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge. That is curiosity. There are others who seek knowledge in order that they themselves may be known. That is vanity. Others seek knowledge in order to sell it. That is dishonorable. And finally, some seek knowledge in order to edify others, and that is love. Now, I'd done the first. That's what a research scientist does. You get people to buy you very expensive toys, and then you play with them for a while and produce results which you try and pretend are important. And if you're good at the pretense, you get some more money for some more toys, and so it goes on. But it's just curiosity. Once I read Bernard's account, I changed my curriculum vitae to my curriculum vanitas, because that's what it is, vanity. Most of us have a few papers at least that we would gladly remove from our CV. They were potboilers. I needed a publication, so I wrote a trivial paper. Amazingly, the trivial papers are easy to publish. The paper that I would first remove from my CV came back from the referees, no comment, publish. I mean, it was boring, it was obvious, it didn't really need doing, but it got published. They don't read my CV, they weigh it. That's the way it works. So I knew about that. The third one is worse. Selling what you know. That doesn't mean making a living. I mean, teachers, although Plato and Socrates would be appalled at the idea of selling teaching even. They thought that should be free. But it was a different world they lived in. You do have to live. But they do mean making a killing. Now we try to limit that these days by various regulations. There are always ways around those regulations, but in my day, there weren't many regulations. And given the things I did had some obvious commercial applications, every now and again I would be asked to give a well-paid lecture by some company or other. Now, being the cynic that I was at that stage, when I was asked to do that, I always took particular note of how close to the date of the lecture we were. Because I knew that if we were very close, it meant they'd asked someone else to do it who'd said yes, and now they'd bailed out on them. And if there was $1 million contract on the line, they didn't want to renege on any of the things they'd promised to the hospital. So I can never resist playing these games. I would just the first thing I would say, I don't really think I want to do that. And they'd double the honorarium. And you can push them to whatever you want. I mean, it's $1 million. What do they care if you charge them several thousand for a weekend? They'll pay. But you've damaged your soul when you do that. You shouldn't do that. And I stopped doing it. But yeah, you can do that. I mean, Obama charges, I don't know what it is now, 250,000 at least for a lecture. I mean, how can you live with yourself and pretend to be a socialist? It's not acceptable. It's totally incoherent. But the last one was the one that really killed me. There's some who seek knowledge in order to edify others. I mean, basically, I'm doing penance this morning, right? Understand what I'm saying? I've got a lot of penance to do before I'm through. But I went home to my good wife and said, Bernard's got to me today. And when I got to the fourth one, I said, you know, I always get my fourth-year honours class down to 20 students because I don't like marking. So the lectures are horrendous and difficult until I've got rid of all but 20 students, and then we start really learning. Now, I was very good at that. So I said, I don't even know their names. We're at question period, but just a second or two longer. And bless her, she said, well, why don't you bring them home for supper? I said, would you feed them? She said, of course. So I invited them. I didn't expect they'd come, but they all came. So she's a good cook, so I had a good meal. They were not Baptists, so it was a very good meal. Just checking that you're awake, that's all. And then we started talking. We didn't play any silly games or anything like that. And I discovered these young people, often from professional homes, had never discussed any of the great existential questions of life at all. So they didn't leave till after midnight, and it became a regular event. And I was guilt-stricken because I hadn't done anything like that before, and I should have been doing it for years. The next one that came along was even nicer in a way, because when I came back from Africa, Bloom had got to me, and somehow I said to medical students in first year biochemistry, a total farce of a course, since they don't remember any of it, I said to them, if Bloom is right, you're an ignorant bunch. And so about 20 of them demanded an apology at the end of the lecture. And I said, well, it's not me, it's Alan Bloom, so I'm not going to apologize, but I think he's saying you're biblically illiterate, so let's test whether you are. Off the cuff, I said, well, tell me, you think the Sermon on the Mount is great teaching. Gandhi thought so, so you're bound to agree with him. Tell me how it starts and what it says. Now, they couldn't answer it at all. And I know it's highly unlikely that more than one or two, in fact, it's highly unlikely that any of you, unless I've got at you before, could tell me the Beatitudes in sequence. And if you don't know them in sequence, you may have memorized them, but you never understood them. If you want to hear more, you have to come to wherever I'm preaching tomorrow morning, because I'm going to talk about it then. But they couldn't do it at all. And I said, well, there you are. Bloom is right. And they said, well, what are you going to do about it? And I said, it's your problem, not mine. And they said, but you claim to know something we don't. Why don't you teach us? I mean, this is non-Christians asking a Christian to do something he ought to do. And I still said no. And then without thinking, I said, well, what you need is an Agnostics Anonymous group because you don't even know the questions, let alone the answers. And they said, yes, that's right. So AA was born on the spot as an extracurricular course. And I taught it for the next few years. And the only prerequisite was you couldn't claim to be a Christian. And I got 25% of the class every year. And I set about teaching them that objective moral truth was real. They thought, you're not going to win that one. Of course, every year I did. It was a lot of fun. Their mind was stimulated. They enjoyed it. And it's true that young people today, they want more than anything else a challenge. They don't want to be stroked. They know that goes nowhere. That's why Jordan Peterson is so successful. He's not a Christian, so they're willing to take him at face value. And basically he says, get your act together. Get your butt up off the seat and do some work. Decide that you need to have a decent life because that's the best way to have a good life. And that decent life should include a family. because otherwise, at the end of your life, you're going to be lonely and miserable. So get your priorities right. He's a non-Christian, but a man who's seeing the truth. Now, in church, where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? Death, suffering, knowledge, ethics, behavior are not discussed. The 6 questions I've discussed earlier, briefly, are not discussed. We've got to change. There's plenty of ways to do it. If you don't have a serious reading group in your church, start one. And it's very easy to do. You can go to my website and you'll find 6 papers there from First Things, which is a magazine that can drive you nuts because you're not Catholic. But just be sympathetic with what Catholics have to deal with. It's a good journal. It's on religion and public policy. And there are some brilliant papers there. So I put 6 down, and you can read any of them and take a paragraph out of any of them and put it in your church bulletin. And then put underneath, if this paragraph interests you, come and talk to me. And you've got a reading group. One American physician heard me talk about this in another talk I give called Why Physicians Hate Church, which they do. He said, after that talk, he said, I sat where I could watch people in the narthex. And I saw people drive up to church tomorrow morning and drop wife and children who went off to Sunday school and said, drop them right at the door, didn't make them walk from the car park. And they said, I'll park, dear, see you in church. But they didn't park in the church parking lot. They went to Starbucks, and they came back just before the children came back from Sunday school and were in church when they got back. But they'd missed all the fluff that they couldn't stand. You know, a doctor arriving at church on a Sunday who's had a bad week, maybe somebody died because they weren't quite at the top of their game. The last thing they want is somebody jigging up and down, singing something as stupid as, I long to feel the embrace of Jesus. No, they need something like the opening prayer of the Anglican Communion service. O Lord, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, from whom no secrets are hid. Cleanse the thoughts of my heart by the inspiration of your Spirit. I mean, that's what we need. Confession. We all need it. Lewis puts it like this, working on his Christian mind in Mere Christianity. He says, repentance is not something God demands of you that he could forego if he wishes. Repentance is simply a description of what coming to God is like. He's right. Did anyone in the Bible have a close encounter with God and start singing happy songs on the spot? That's not what happens, is it? What happens? Boom, flat on your face. Think of Isaiah in the temple, or John on Patmos, or Peter when he realized who Jesus was. No, if you haven't known repentance, you haven't been in God's presence in the way that you can be. Because he's pure holiness. Unrepentant, he's not going to let you too close for your own safety. He wants you to come, but you've got to come on his terms, not yours. And with that, I should have stopped before. Are there any questions? That's the key question. The other thing is, go ahead, get your lunch if that's what you want to do. I don't know what. It's 20 to 12. I don't know why the obsessive compulsives stopped me at that point. Oh, there's other things happening. Yes, Mark.
John, can you explain to us the developments that just happened in Canada this year regarding euthanasia?
The development of? Oh, no. Yeah. I mean, I couldn't believe it when I read it. When Obama put the Obamacare Act through and said that it was a doctor's duty to kill patients, I wish I could have been in front of him. I would have said 2 words. Dred Scott. How many of you know what I've just done? Not enough again, you see. This is retreat into pietism. Dred Scott is the most egregiously unjust decision your Supreme Court has ever made. It was the decision that said that slaves were not people, they were property. That a black president could say that the rights of conscience of a doctor have no meaning in the face of the law, that the law is more important than conscience, that's unbelievable. The next thing, if he was willing for the discussion, would be Do you wish your family to be cared for by a doctor with or without moral integrity? Everybody wants a doctor with moral integrity. We are no longer a culture with a moral consensus, so we need the Catholic doctrine of subsidiarity. The funding of everything cannot be done on a national basis when it's a moral issue at stake, because we don't have a moral consensus. So the funding has to be pushed down to the level where there is a moral consensus. I want to see the medical system split up to real Christian and real secularist. There may be some other subgroups, but that's the big two. The so-called Baptist hospitals are not Baptist at all. I mean, the Protestants have lost it completely. The Catholics are holding on by a thread. It's amazing, again, Obama must know that it's Catholics who've provided the care for the poorest of Americans to a large degree, plus the clinics for the indigent poor, which have lots of evangelicals. But we're not discussing it. We need to. We need to be ready. We have answers in the Christian community for the state we're in. See, we no longer have nation states in the sense that Bloom wanted, where he said a community is defined by a common belief. We don't have a common belief. In fact, Toynbee, who studied this for the whole of his life, said the first fracture line for a culture that's falling apart is precisely this one. He named 6 things that happen. He studied 20-plus cultures that had come and gone. Cultures have a lifetime and they disappear. Only the Jews get a second bite at the cherry. No other cultures come back from the decline to dominance. And the first one, he says, is loss of moral consensus. No, you lose a common idea of what good and evil is. We don't have that in North America. We don't have that anywhere in the Western world, do we? What some of us call evil, others call human flourishing. I mean, you can't beware when you call good evil and evil good. We have no agreement about that anymore. So that's gone already. So when that's gone, laws are passed by either side, which a lot of people can't respect. You can't respect the Obamacare lack of rights of conscience. You can't respect abortion law as such. You can accept it, you can't respect it. We've got to learn to live together as what we are. We live together for purely material reasons because we have no moral agreement. But it undermines our commitment to being law-abiding citizens. I mean, you're not going to push hard to see that everybody gets their sexual rights and everybody gets their abortion rights, etc. That's the other side's problem. And vice versa. They're not going to push to see that we get our rights of freedom as to what our children are taught at what age. So that leads to increasing lack of respect for law, which is bad news. That's why our society is falling apart. I mean, I live in the country where the last of the old world still exists. I had a car in my driveway for a long while. I have one now that has the key in the ignition. And people know it's there, and they use it. And I win on the deal because it's got the most incredible fuel consumption rate from my point of view, because they return it full. That's as things used to be. Even where I grew up in industrial Birmingham, we didn't lock our doors. We do now. My mother, who had the gift of what I do, it's a family trait, so she was often, although she left school at 12, she was invited to speak to women's groups all over the city. And she would come home sometimes after dark, sometimes quite late. We never had a car. She walked 10 minutes through semi-darkened streets in the British equivalent of Detroit, and my father was not bothered in the least because there were 0 attacks on women. 0. If there had been one scream, every door would have opened. The guy wouldn't have been alive to greet the police. It wasn't that it wasn't done, it wasn't thinkable. That world is gone. That's the breakdown, the lawlessness that grows. Now, as it grows, you become more and more discontented with your contribution to your society. You wonder what you can do. And so you start retreating into drugs and alcohol. You need to switch off the worries that are around you. A lot of drug addicts are highly sensitive people who just can't stand the world they're in. They have to escape. Then you become more and more apathetic, so you stop voting. And it is crazy for America to prescribe democracy for the rest of the world when most times you don't get 50% of people out to most of your elections. It's not viable. The next thing that happens is even worse. You get two forms of promiscuity. One, intellectual. The modern student has no problem with holding totally incoherent ideas in their head simultaneously. And the other one is sexual promiscuity. When I went to medical school, none of the girls in the class would have sex. This was pre-pill. The only people who had sex were the nurses, and they ran an abortion clinic after midnight in the OR. That was a different world. The pill came along, that all changed. And the result of sex education, well, I don't know what the exact figure is, but it's not, you could get through finals if you knew 4 when I took finals. You didn't need any more. You need at least 5 times that now, if not 10. Mainly courtesy of the homosexual community. So, as somebody said to me, do infectious diseases. Nobody's going to be out of employment in infectious diseases, particularly sexual diseases, in the next 20 years. That's where we've got to. That's the world we're in. And the church looks the other way. It won't do. We're supposed to be salt and light. And salt is to preserve what is good and destroy what is evil. Long answer. I hope it helps. Yes? You have to be louder, I'm sorry.
You had said there were six great stories in 2.
Yeah.
What was the list?
The list is animistic paganism is the basic one. Then in the West you've got Judaism, Christianity and Islam, and in the East you've got Hinduism and Buddhism and their offshoots. And then you've got the post-Christian heresies, which are actually 2, that adds up to 7 actually, doesn't it? One is Marxism and the other is capitalism, both of which depend upon denying the sinfulness of human beings. The one Christian doctrine, as Chesterton says, that surely everybody knows is true. And Jordan Peterson says the same. If you don't recognize your own inner problems, you're stupid. Sin is real. And of course, they don't believe in sin anymore because they don't believe in objective moral truth. And sin is going against objective moral truth. So I say to them, I'm very sorry for you because you are actually sinful, but you don't know it because you can't define it that way. The only solution to sin is repentance, restitution, and grace. And they don't make sense to you. You're stuck. Sorry. And we do much better at challenging them with how they get to a better spot from where they are now. That's what Jesus did with Nicodemus, isn't it? Nicodemus wanted to teach like Jesus did, and Jesus says, you can't get to where you want to go from where you are now. You've got to be born again first. The Holy Spirit has to come into your life. And I can't tell anyone how to do that, except that if you search, you will find. Anything up to 25 years, as with my friend John Robson. It was 10 years for John Wesley. So the idea that you can choose to become a Christian at this moment is historically very difficult to defend. It can happen, but you can't say it will happen. You can say, if you search, God promises you will find. He doesn't say when. And the more serious the job he has for you in mind, the longer he makes you struggle, as far as I can see. Paul had a long journey because you need to learn some things along the way. Any other questions?